Ms Graham.
Thank you. Before lunch, there were a couple of little technological glitches, and I would like to go back just to clarify both of those without labouring them. The first was when we were talking about page 6 of your report, and under reference to paragraphs J and then K on page, which is at the top of page 7. Yeah. And we were looking for section 8 on batons, and I think we'd inadvertently put the wrong manual on the screen. And so the actual manual that we were wanting to look at was the instructor manual from 2012, PS 12330. That was the manual that's 266 pages long. And we were hoping to look at pages 184 and 185, which are actually at 182, 183 of the PDF. Yeah. So let's just put that on the screen just in case anyone's looking at this later. So this is the Module 8 straight baton, and this is the module within the instructor manual.
That's correct, yes.
That you were referring to. And if we can look at, we see the pages down at the bottom. If we can look at page 184 and 185 that are referred to in your report, we see physical force and escalation of trauma chart. And keep going, please. This is about the use of force and potential trauma. And then we come to the area of target areas, red areas, green, and the primary and secondary targets. And so that was the actual, we had the wrong manual on the screen. And I won't go into that. I think you've made your position clear on that. And then the second element that we want to clarify was when we were talking about the use of force SOP, which is PS 10933, section 6.2. This was under reference to page 7 of your report, Mr. Greaves, which paragraph L.
Yes.
L for Lima. And we looked at, if we look at section 6.2, just to refresh everyone's mind, this was about the definition of use of force. And I said, you made comments about some of the things that weren't in that definition. Yes. And then we said we would look at form 064001, which was referred to in 6.5. We see at the bottom of the screen. And again, just to clarify, if we could look at PERC 04585. Now, you had pointed out in the definition section at 6.2 of the SOP, things like empty hand, restraint, takedown, handcuffs and fast straps weren't mentioned at all.
Yes.
But I think we see in this form, it's a PAVA spray discharge report. The previous one we looked at was also about PAVA spray and discharge. Yes, yeah. And if we can move down the screen. Going. There's a section which talks about the circumstances and provides some prompts, if I can put it that way, questions, which will assist perhaps an officer who's declaring use of force in relation to the spray.
Yes, only in relation to the spray so far, unless it's further down the further down the form.
And then if we could just look further down. There is also additional OST tactics and equipment used during incident, and there is a section that talks about empty hands, handcuffs, fast straps and other items there.
Yeah, that form seems particularly focused on the use of an irritant or incapacitant spray, whereby a general use of force would start with the empty hands, etc., and PAVA or CS discharge would be one of the tactical options, rather than being specifically around PAVA.
Absolutely. Thank you. And then I think just before we broke for lunch, we agreed we would move on to criteria 2. We'd looked at section 3 of your report and the 7 criteria for training which was fit for purpose, and we were about to move on to criteria 2, which is methodology for delivery with set competencies to measure against. And I think, first of all, in section 3C of your report. So if you can look at page 4 of your report, I won't have this on the screen, but if you could look at it, please. Page 4, section 3C, you say neither the 2015 lesson plans reviewed, and we've referred to them earlier today,
Yes.
nor the 2013 Officer Safety Training Student Manual, which we've also referred to and looked at, contain any actual competencies for physical skills. Could you tell us what a competency is?
A competency is something that the student has to achieve or show the trainer in relation to the particular skill. So if we relate to, say, a driving lesson or a driving test, reverse parking, parallel parking, navigating a roundabout, a student would have to show that to be able to be shown as competent in that particular skill. Officer safety skills are no different. There should be a set of criteria that an individual has to show or demonstrate to show that they are competent in using that particular piece of equipment. An example of that may be the application of handcuffs. So certain competencies in relation to handcuff application or certain methodologies in the way that the handcuffs are applied should be evidenced by the student. These should be listed somewhere, either in the manual for the reference for the students to show what they need to achieve or what they should be trying to achieve, or for the trainer in relation to what they should be looking for and need to tick off to be able to sign that individual off as competent in that particular skill.
And so the competent application of handcuffs would hopefully avoid risk to the subject or to the officer.
Yes, for example, if they placed them on in the wrong position on the wrist, if they put them on too tight, if they failed to get the subject in the correct position, finishing position, they could all be set competencies that if a student didn't do that, basically, then they wouldn't be shown as competent and they would have to show it again or do it again.
Or perhaps have further training.
Yes.
Thank you. So, what would you have expected to see, having identified that there weren't any competencies for physical skills, what would you have expected to see either in the manual or the lesson plan or anything like that sort?
A short list of bullet points showing what is expected of the student. Without that, then that is very much left down to the subjective approach of the trainer as to whether they believe that individual is competent or not. So it's very much based upon their own views rather than a set of criteria that can be used across to standardise that approach to whether an individual is competent or not.
Thank you. And then paragraph D on page 4. I have been unable to find any form of documented knowledge check to show that a student had absorbed and understood what they were taught. And I'm interested in this comment. What's a documented knowledge check?
So again, if we're talking about physical skills and we're talking about competencies, the other side of officer safety training is obviously the knowledge base around use of force, human rights, etc. And that needs to be shown that an individual officer has taken that on board and can basically use that skill, that knowledge when they're applying them. If they haven't got that knowledge and we have no way of basically saying that a particular officer has achieved or has taken that knowledge on board, the normal process for this would be some form of check test, knowledge check test, questionnaire, something that would allow the officer to show by answering questions or providing oral evidence that they know what the point is and B, what the application is.
And is this to ensure that for the person being trained, they're not simply sitting in the room thinking about what's for tea,
Yes.
that they're actually comprehending what's being said, that they're able to recollect what was said and put that into practice?
Yes, I mean, for example, we've talked about positional asphyxia. A question may be formulated around list 4 risk factors for positional asphyxia, and we would expect out of that list of sort of 8 or 9 risk factors that an officer would be able to tell me 4 of those risk factors from the lesson that they've been given. As I said, across the documentation that I've gone over, I haven't been able to find any documented version of how that is done, and if it was done, in what format.
So no apparent way to assess to what extent the person being trained is engaging with the lesson and taking it in.
Yes. Other than the possibility of the trainer doing live questions during the session to the audience, but only obviously if certain individuals can answer those, not everybody in the room would then be able to show that they've got that knowledge.
And then leaving aside competencies for the moment and thinking about methodology for delivery, which is also part of this criteria, can I ask you a couple of things that we've heard evidence about in the inquiry? One relates to scenario-based training, and we've heard some mention of that as a method of delivery of training. There's online training, there's perhaps PowerPoint presentations, a lecture, a demonstration, but one of them is scenario-based. Now, you mention this at paragraph X in your report. So if we could have a quick look at that, page 10.
Yeah.
Again, I don't need this on the screen. And you talk here about scenario-based training and say this has long been an established and successful method of testing and cementing skills in OST. I have not found any actual evidence on this method being used as at the relevant time. The 2015 OST review mentions most refresher courses only containing techniques on a cooperative person. To increase realism but maintain safety, a degree of resistance is required from a subject to trigger an officer's response to apply a technique. And this is also tested where trainers conduct stress testing during realistic training scenarios. Both these methods were and are used across the UK during OST sessions.
Yes.
I'm interested if you could help the Chair understand a little more about these scenario-based training and the benefits of that.
Yes, they're designed to implement the behavioural changes in an officer or a pair of officers when dealing with set situations. Very easy to sort of teach somebody a new skill. When you ask them to then apply that skill in an operational context, lots of things can go awry and can go wrong. So the idea of simulated scenarios or testing them under a degree of pressure to get their heart rate increased, to get them to be able to respond correctly during times of stress and of conflict is a valid tool to be able to test that behavioural side. It also tests things like their communication skills, their ability to manage conflict and use the correct type of tactics and terminology. And it's then a good tool afterwards for them to be able to explain and brief the trainers in relation to their decision-making process. So there's an awful lot can come out of a scenario-based event, not least of all that pressure testing of a skill, an ability to talk to people, an ability to use de-escalation tools to resolve a situation.
And what benefits would you envisage for an officer or a probationer who's being trained in a scenario-based training session? What are the benefits when they come to doing operational duties?
Well, we call it to some degree stress inoculation. If the first time an officer is asked or required to do something that is outside of their normal frame of reference, for example, this may be the first time they've ever had anybody shout at them, confront them, offer them signs of physical resistance. If that's the first time in a live scenario, we can't always guarantee how that officer is going to respond. By using realistic scenario training, you can inoculate the person against that. It's a very similar reason as to why we expose officers initially to the effects of an incapacitating spray or an irritant spray, so they understand that if it happens in a live scenario, what it is, they won't panic to the extent that they may panic, and they're able to self-administer aftercare. So it's about preparing them the best we can within safety parameters for the job that they're going to be expected to do. and using that scenario to give them opportunities to practice those skills in a safe environment, but with as much realism and realistic resistance as possible.
And is that realism an important aspect of scenario-based training?
Very much so, very much so, yes. It's about giving them the best opportunity possible, maybe for the first time ever in their lives, to witness and actually see not just what that situation may be like, but what their natural response might be to that type of stimulus.
And then would that training then allow them to reflect on their reactions and discuss that in a supported environment?
Yes, as I say, that that's the latter part of any scenario. You'd stop the scenario and then you'd debrief it, and you'd talk about what they did, why they did it. They would have to explain their rationale, their thought processes. We would discuss what tactical options they'd chosen, possibly discuss alternative tactical options that they may have been able to use or consider, and then they go away much better prepared for should they meet a similar scenario out in the real world out there in practice. Then they've got something in their back pocket to rely upon and refer to in relation to how possibly to deal with that.
And is that why you call it a stress inoculation?
Yes. Yes.
So that physically practicing a scenario will reduce the stress levels the more often it's done.
Yes, it's one of the tools that we can use to try and make them better prepared for those higher stress situations. Yes.
And is that akin to just building up their levels of experience?
Yes, I mean, if you think of somebody who's just passed their driving test, the first time they go on the motorway and they're driving at speed, it can be quite a daunting task. So it's a similar thing. It's giving them opportunity to experience that in a realistic form, but still safely, where they're not going to cause danger to themselves or others in that type of situation.
Thank you. And then the other aspect of delivery I'd like to ask you about, you covered in paragraph W of your report, which is at the bottom of page 9. And you talk here about the frequency of refresher training. And we've heard different evidence about frequency, the benefits and disadvantages of the current system and what that could look like. But what you say here is you couldn't see any documentation that was available, and it highlighted work in England and Wales regarding this and links to health and safety legislation regarding annual refresher training and what was recommended. And I think you point out in paragraph W, the standard across the UK has been 12 hours for many years.
Yes.
Some forces exceed this, however some fell short, only delivering 8 hours. ACPO produced best practice guidance in 2009.
Yes.
And tell us who ACPO are.
That's the Association of Chief Police Officers, now the National Police Chief thing.
Thank you. Which reinforced the annual requirement. At the time of this incident, that's in 2015, is it?
Yeah.
The 12-hour refresher was widely accepted across England and Wales.
Yes.
And from your knowledge of what was being delivered in Scotland in 2015, or in the period up to 2015, how many hours were officers in Scotland?
From what I've reviewed and my knowledge of the situation at the time, it was annually one session of 8 hours.
Right.
But that 8 hours, again, isn't stipulated as contact time. It just says an 8-hour session. So in normal circumstances, if you then build in refreshment breaks, etc., that contact time could be as little as 5 or 6 hours.
Thank you. Let's move on to criteria 3. And this is a recognised level of trainer competence to deliver the programme. And also 4, a process of check testing and developing the trainers. So these 2 criteria relate very much to the trainers rather than those being trained.
That's correct, yes.
And I think if we could look at we'll look at paragraph N for November, which I think is page 7. Yes, it's at the bottom of page 7. And you say, in 2015, all OST trainers had to undergo an initial trainer's course. It would appear that some of these trainers were brought over from their legacy forces, where they had been delivering different programmes with different equipment. You've touched on that
Yes.
earlier. I have been unable to find evidence or a document that shows that these trainers were standardised or any form of programme was put in place to refresh or update them. Any new trainers would have been trained centrally, so should have been subject to that programme. Now, I'd like to ask you about some evidence we've heard from Inspector Young. Now, Inspector Young has given us evidence on 2 separate occasions, but he did talk about his review, which we've mentioned earlier, the OST review, and he said that was mainly about standardisation of processes and procedures. So he had recognised the need for that, and I think that commenced in December 2014. He said in evidence on day 23 of the inquiry, the training model depended on the legacy force area. If you were in the old Strathclyde area, then that training was delivered by full-time, OST, team managed and by a sergeant.
Yeah.
If you were in any other forces or legacy forces or divisions, then the OST was delivered by part-time divisional officers who came in and delivered OST as and when required, and each division had its own, I suppose, governance procedures in place. So it would appear that from the legacy forces there was not standardisation in terms of even the staff, the OST trainers being full-time or part-time.
Yes.
He said that when he carried out his review, he said, I suppose the officer safety training representative from each of the legacy force areas he contacted personally. He conducted a number of focus groups and he spoke to instructors. He spoke to students and officers. And what he discovered was that the core source reference document, that's the 2013 manual, subsequently, or at the same time, he discovered there were a number of other source documents being used. There were some legacy force documents being used. There was outdated, older versions of the manual. We had legacy force documents, and we had instructors who didn't use the manual at all. So it was disparate, as he put it. And he said one of the challenges we faced, we had instructors of all ages and experience. We had instructors who had been trained back in the 90s. I have absolutely no idea what training material they ever got or what training course they received. When I started, they were just instructors. We had instructors who attended an instructor's course at Tullyallen. That way we knew roughly what they'd been taught. So they may have been reference material they used from legacy forces that I couldn't track down. When I questioned them, why are you teaching that particular technique? It's not in the manual. I've never seen it before. A regular response was, well, so-and-so taught me this back in the day, and I still use it, I still like it. So it really was very, very disparate. And there were 200 OST instructors, and he wasn't able to speak to them all. So in light of that, against that background, if that evidence is correct, does that cause you to have concerns about the OST trainers who were training officers, either as probationers or refreshers, in that period up to 2015?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't had the opportunity to speak to any local forces, purely being through the documents, but I would have grave concerns over finding that evidence or being alluded to that process taking place within a force area equivalent to Police Scotland, and the fact that you could technically have 200 different versions of a particular programme being delivered at any one time.
Thank you. And then in relation to competencies, he said on day 71, so this was in November of last year, he came back to the inquiry. He said there were no set assessment criteria for students. There was no method in place to assess the competency of trainers. There was no quality assurance processes in place. And I asked him specifically about P Division, which covered the area of Kirkcaldy.
Yeah, 5 in total.
And he said yes, but it was replicated throughout the country, to be honest, he said. So it would appear that your suspicions, if Inspector Young's correct in that, then it would appear your suspicions are correct.
Yes,
There
I
wasn't.
think his testimony completely supported my findings from the documentation.
Thank you. Can we move on to criteria 5? This is a method of monitoring delivery. And I think you deal with this on page 8 of your report,
Yep.
at paragraph O, O for Oscar. And here you say, from the formation of Police Scotland, there was no agreed monitoring of OST training delivery at a local level. It appears that the central delivery team took care of new officers, but did not have direct control of local delivery. Without this oversight, trainers would be able to modify techniques or provide inaccurate or dated information during their sessions. And I think to some extent you've perhaps touched on this earlier, but could you explain your concerns about monitoring?
Yes, I mean, again, the main function of monitoring is the standardisation of the message or the programme, but also as a purely as a safety point of view in relation to the delivery of the training. We're talking about physical skills, so making sure that those physical skills are being delivered safely, and also that safety is then being reflected onto the public by officers not being taught to do things in an incorrect methodology that might injure individuals or members of the public when they're applied. So without that process in place, you've got no checks and balances to ensure that that standardisation is taking place. You could have completely different things happening, next door to each other or literally the opposite sides of the country. The process I would have expected to have in place, and I say it's supported by Inspector Young, where he said there wasn't anything in place, would have at least had, at the local level, an individual officer, maybe a sergeant, responsible for that local delivery, and then he would feed back into the centre in relation to any issues, or he would be able to disseminate or cascade any updates from the centre. That at least I would expect that. If not, as I say, in relation to a lot of other forces that have central units or groups that deliver and monitor, they would go out to any cascade trainers at least annually to see them in the workplace, or those trainers would be brought back in to attend a refresher session whereby they would be tested and checked to make sure that they were delivering things in the correct manner.
Thank you. Now, in your report, you go on to mention a number of issues regarding best practice, and we'll come on to that in a moment. There was one other aspect of evidence that we heard from Inspector Young that I'd like to ask you about, and this related to method of training delivery or monitoring delivery. And he said that there were trainers would use a mix of two different types of training, EDIP
Yep.
and problem, solution and teach. So they were two separate methods he described. And I think he said EDIP is explain, demonstrate, imitate and practice. And problem, solution, teach is just a different teaching method. So an EDIP instructor would explain what the technique entails, and that instructor would then demonstrate that technique to the students. They would then imitate that and go away and practice that. The problem, solution, teach, he said, whereas that one is just a different teaching method, whereas opposed to explaining first, you would demonstrate what the problem is that you're trying to overcome. You would then give them a solution, and that would be the technique, and then they would go and practice. And he said there was a mix of that in P Division because EDIP was the teaching method employed by Lothian and Borders Police, and Problem Solution Teach was the teaching method employed by the Scottish Police College. So he seemed to be describing different approaches being taken to the training. So prior to Police Scotland, if you did your OST instructors course delivered by the senior instructors from Lothian and Borders, they would teach you EDIP. But if you did your instructors course at the Scottish Police College, you would have been instructed to deliver problem solution. And I asked him if that was maybe slightly confusing, the different approaches, and he said yes, he thought that could give rise to confusion.
Yes.
Do you have any comments to make on that evidence?
Both of those methodologies are sound. My surprise is that with the opportunity of Police Scotland in 2013, that a decision wasn't made in relation to how the force wanted to move forward, because I would expect that one teaching method to be used across all of their training programs and packages. Having different methodologies to deliver, you know, as you say, even in the same division, you could have an officer attending with one particular trainer being taught how to do it one way, and then attending the next session with a different trainer and being shown it completely differently. Still the same subject matter, but being put across in a completely different way, which is, as Inspector Young would say, can confuse. I'm sure would confuse a lot of students.
Thank you. Turning to section 6, criteria 6, I should say. This is systems to review and develop the programme with access to independent sources of information and expertise. And I think at this section you do talk about the reviews which had been carried out by Police Scotland. And we've already mentioned the one done by Inspector Young,
Yes.
which started in December 2014. And you also mention in paragraphs S to V, which is page 9 of your report, and in particular at paragraph T for Tango, Scotland had 2 such reviews conducted, and you mention one in 2010 by ACPOS in 2010, and then you mention one in 2015, which was the review done by Inspector Young. So one was prior to Police Scotland coming into being created in April 2013, and one was shortly after in 2015. And you say this later report was published, that's the 2015 one, just prior to the relevant event, so it provides a good overview of the state of OST delivery at that time.
Yeah.
Now, would it be your view then, Mr. Graves, that when the chair comes to look at issues with training, that a good comparison would be the review carried out by Inspector Young?
I think it would, yes, but I think it's important to recognise that the 2010 review highlights a great deal of similar issues and makes very, very similar recommendations as that made by Inspector Young. That would have been known to the senior management at the time prior to the formation of Police Scotland. My surprise is that that review was not incorporated into a work stream when Police Scotland was formed. I would have expected, and I think that would have been a sensible process to say we've identified these problems across the legacy forces. We need to ensure that those problems aren't brought across to the new organisation. How do we go about doing that? And that doesn't seem to have been picked up. It seems to have just dropped off the radar. And it's then taken another 2 years after the formation of Police Scotland for the same or very similar recommendations to be made by Inspector Young.
And Inspector Young told us he had 28 recommendations when he did his review, but many of these were similar to the 2010 review.
Yes, he actually stipulates that in his report that he references the 2010 report and the fact that the similarities in the recommendations. So even he was trying to highlight, we knew about this 5 years ago, but what went on, nothing, what happened.
So even though perhaps his review wasn't published until 2015, the previous review would have allowed changes and recommendations to be implemented within that period. can we look at paragraph AA? So we move now on to page 10 of your
Yeah.
report. And here you talk about the 2015 OST review report. That's Inspector Young's report. It provides information on the delivery of OST prior to the formation of PS from the above report, as well as identified the need for a fresh review 18 months after the formation of Police Scotland. And you mentioned Inspector Young's evidence here.
Yes.
According to the evidence of Inspector Young, it appears that OST did not have a coordinating work stream within Police Scotland until November 2014.
Yes.
Unlike firearms and public order training, which did have work streams. And I think the 2014 work was done by Inspector Young. I think he gave, I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, but I think he gave evidence that he felt he wanted to do that work, but it wasn't necessarily part of his job description.
Yes.
Even though legacy forces had many variations in equipment, programmes, techniques and methods of delivery, these processes were allowed to continue. So there wasn't they weren't prevented from just carrying on as they had before. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's what I found from the lack of work stream from the 2010 report.
It is surprising that such an important training programme such as OST was not a prioritised work stream during the formation of Police Scotland from the original forces. Excuse me. I would have expected the setting up of a central unit to oversee the transition, amalgamation, monitoring and quality assurance of the OST content, delivery and trainer development, especially with the knowledge and recommendations of the 2010 review.
Yes.
And I'd like you to explain to the Chair what you would have expected after the 2010 review to allow that work stream to be created and developed.
I think with it highlighted and the recommendations in place, considering a work stream had been put in place for other major training programmes such as firearms and public order, unfortunately officer safety is sometimes seen as the poor relation, but I think that was an ideal opportunity which has been missed by a new organisation starting from scratch, to be able to really push the good practice, best practice forward, because the 2010 report even has a comparison in it in relation to what was happening across the rest of the UK. In fact, I remember that particular report, and I remember speaking to the author of that report when I was still serving and giving basically information and evidence in relation to how other forces across the country were working, and pointed him in the direction of good examples across the rest of the UK to say, speak to this person, they'll explain how they deliver and what processes they've got in place. So I actually remember this report being done. From memory, I think it was the lead gentleman from Strathclyde at the time who was the author. So having all that information and that best practice available, I find it to some degree a little bit staggering that that hasn't been picked up by an organisation fresh off the mark and being able to, put it in place at the very outset of the formulation. It seems to have been an afterthought, and it's only been pushed to some degree by an officer within the ranks recognising the issues and, shouting loud enough for somebody to take notice and pick up on what his concerns were.
Thank you. And I think you explained earlier today that in 2010 you were still employed in the Met.
Yes.
You were heavily involved in training. I think you said perhaps you were head of training or were just finishing up that year.
At the point, I finished
role.
in 2010, but I was still considered I was the subject matter expert, so I dictated the programme, so I created the training. I just didn't have any hands-on delivery requirement from my new role, because I was doing more of the monitoring, looking at the use of force reports and that, in guiding the programme.
More strategic,
yes,
rather than hands-on.
Yes.
And it would appear from your own experience that when the 2010 review was being carried out, that contact was being made with people like yourself in the Met to find out what other training was being done by forces elsewhere?
Well, the approach was direct to me as the secretary at the time of the ACPO committee, and they requested contacts within the UK for they could speak to. So I gave them contacts at different forces, different sizes, different makeups, etc. So they could have a comparison of, I think at the time, it was 4 or 5 forces I put them in contact with, including I provided information from the Met for them to do a comparison between then the legacy forces within the ACPOS region and the ACPO region.
Thank you. And then paragraph BB at the bottom of page 10, you say the report has sections on all the relevant Police Scotland divisions. The following statement in relation to the OST programme appears in all these reviews. It follows the current PSC Tully-Allen programme for annual recertification. However, there are numerous mentions of additional techniques being taught, additional equipment being used, and legacy force variations apparent. An example of this mentions pain compliance techniques being taught by one division but not the others. It also mentions that these did not form part of the PSC programme. Can you elaborate on what you mean there?
Yeah, so the opening statement in the report says that everybody was following the same programme. But with the investigation that the author undertook, it was obvious that that wasn't the case. So there were differences in not just in relation to the programmes, but equipment, but also the fact that techniques were being taught, although not dangerous and recognised elsewhere, but they did not form part of the original student officer input and were not in the 2013, or back then, the manual at the time, being produced and being used by Tully-Allen at the college.
Thank you. Now, you've mentioned once or twice best practice, and I said we would come on to that. If we could look at paragraph Q, so go back to page 8 of your report. You say best practice is to use an intelligence-led process to look at the relevance, effectiveness and impact of any OST programme. A programme should reduce the risk of injuries to staff and the public by being medically, legally and operationally defensible. Can you just expand on that sentence, please?
Yes, so those 3 areas, or the review processes for any techniques or any proposed changes to an OST programme. Access to medical review is imperative. So if somebody was to come forward with I saw this, or I've been trained in this by, I've been on a course and this looks really good, I think we should put it in the manual. The simple methodology would just be, yeah, great, put it in. But obviously, is it medically safe to do so? Are there considerations medically that we need to think about? Legally, where does it sit? Does it sit within our current powers of using force? But more specifically, how would it impact on human rights in relation to our application of force? And then operationally, when we look at that, is it going to work? Is it going to help? Is it going to be something? Have we already got something that allows us to achieve the same goal? So are we just adding to the requirements of officers to learn something new, or have we already got something? So those sort of 3 basic criteria should always be considered when looking at changes. When I talk about the evidence, or the using intelligence-led, which is big posh terminology, what we're talking about is using sources of information that will allow us to make decisions. So the sorts of things we're looking at there is, are we hurting more people? Are we getting more injuries from a particular technique that officers are using? Are we getting more complaints from members of the public who are being, say for example, handcuffed? So complaints are an important source of information. Injuries to officers. Are officers getting injured more? And if they are getting injured, how are they getting injured? can we put something in place that will try and reduce those injuries to those officers? So using all of these evidential sources of information help us to tailor, take things out, put things in, modify things, consider new pieces of equipment. So if you think about the development of officer safety over the sort of the last 20 years, things like incapacitating sprays coming in, tasers coming in, spit hoods, leg restraints or fast straps as they're called here. All of those things have been developments and have been brought in as a result of things happening and the way that officers are dealing with people having to change. The other big thing that needs to be incorporated or should be incorporated is findings from inquiries like this, inquest, coroner's recommendations, where information is coming in that helps us to understand better why things have happened and why things might have gone wrong, and therefore how can we alter that? What are the recommendations as to how to change or modify what we're doing or how we're doing it to better reduce that risk of it occurring again? So all of those things should be incorporated in the review process and show best practice in how we develop our packages. The simple answer is if it shouldn't stand still. It should be a developing program. It should be a growing item, an entity that grows on its own and changes. But without access to all of this information and these sources, we can't do that.
So it's really not as simple as identifying best or good practice from another force and tagging it on at the end of a chapter.
No, it must be suitable and incorporated into what you're doing. If you find that it's going to benefit across those three criteria, it's going to benefit your officers and the people that you serve.
Thank you. And you mention a number of these things, focus groups, staff questionnaires and such like, to provide you with that intelligence.
Yeah.
And you say then, reading on, in 2015, although these sources were available, no one specifically tasked to carry out this work or interrogate the various systems this information would not be collated or be of any strategic use.
That's correct. Yeah.
So without having someone in position to really interrogate the sources and the intelligence and the data, they weren't able to glean useful information from that.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. Useful information in the sense of OST training and what was required.
Yeah, I mean, all of those things would probably be in place, but it's A, getting access to them, and B, as I say, having somebody central to say, right, I've got all of these, crunch the numbers, what have we got, what are the findings from this information?
And then you go on to say using outside sources can also benefit when looking at what and how OST is being taught. And you give 3 bullet points here. This should include access to medical advice in the various specialties concerned. This is likely to include trauma, respiratory, orthopaedic and pathology. 2, reference to legal advice where necessary in relation to court judgments, coroner's recommendations, inquiry findings, civil litigation, etc. And 3, access to peer groups, other forces, national committees, outside training organisations offering alternative programmes.
Yes.
So a combination of looking beyond the borders and actually looking at other areas, and that could be other forces or it could be somebody else completely.
Yeah, I mean, any organisation that uses similar techniques or faces similar situations. Certainly, when I was in post, we had close links with the health service, so in relation to secure health facilities, the prison service, border force and immigration, but also looking at outside organisations, looking at other countries, looking at places like America. What were they doing? I mean, America has been one of at the forefront of development in relation to acute behavioural disorder and excited delirium, and a lot of what research they've done there has come across to the UK.
And certainly, you were talking about the 2010 review, And the author was clearly looking at other forces around the country.
Yes.
And then you point out, at the relevant time in 2015, there appears to have been no medical review of the OST programme. No formal agreement was in place until 2017, when Dr. Stevenson was engaged to review the Police Scotland OST programme. And was that something else that caused you concern?
Yes, I was surprised that there wasn't access to some form of medical review. There was likely to be access to legal through the service's own legal department, but I couldn't find any evidence in relation to medical review.
We've heard evidence from Inspector Young on day 71, November last year, and he talked about Dr. Stevenson, who we've also heard evidence from. He is a consultant in accident and emergency medicine at Glasgow Royal Infirmary. And Inspector Young said he was asked to sit on a group looking at the management of persons under the influence of new psychoactive substances in a custody environment from an officer safety use of force perspective. And Dr. Stevenson was in that group, and that's how they'd initially met.
Yes.
I became aware of his work about acute behavioural disturbance, which Inspector Young was extremely interested in. And they made contact, and Inspector Young attended a number of presentations delivered by Dr. Stevenson, seminars, and he then visited the College of Policing because they were putting together a national acute behavioural disturbance training package.
Yes.
And I think you know something of that. We'll come on to that later today. On the back of that work, the inspector developed the training package and had Dr. Stevenson, he said, clinically assure, make sure it was accurate. He raised it with the senior management that he was concerned about the provenance of the previous manual, the 2013 manual, and the provenance of the medical information that was being shared via that manual to
Yes.
probationers and those doing refresher courses. He said he was concerned about the accuracy of the medical information contained within that manual and whether it had ever been clinically assured, and he was told no, they didn't think it had been clinically assured. And he said, the Inspector Young said, for me a priority was to ensure that any medical information we were providing in our manual was clinically assured, accurate, current. And that's when I proposed the creation of a clinical governance group, primarily to clinically assure what we were delivering within OST training.
Yes.
And so that appears to have been part of Inspector Young's role, which he took on himself as part of this 2015 review. But certainly in light of his evidence, there hadn't been any medical assurance provided regarding the 2013 manual.
No, say in the rest of the UK, we had access to a group that was set up and funded by the Home Office, who were an independent medical advisory panel, and they reviewed all of the manual contents and even came along and were given demonstrations of all the various techniques, etc., and made a raft of recommendations which went into the new medical implications section, which I say was updated and published in 2012. So we were slightly ahead of the curve. And going back to ABD, you know, we were doing work on acute behavioural disorder going back to 2007, 2008, and I've produced, you know, some evidence on that as well as exhibits in relation to what we were doing as far back as then in relation to developing training and developing knowledge and understanding of excited delirium stroke acute behavioural disorder.
And I think you've also provided to the inquiry a video about people with mental health difficulties and how they can be dealt with by the police.
That's correct, and that came out the back of talking about the review process. There was a review into how officers dealt with mental health in the community, and recommendations from that was a recommendation in relation to the changing of the training and increasing the awareness of officers around that particular subject matter. So a production company were instructed by the Met to help produce a training video for all our staff back in 2009. And that came off the back of one of the things that we used in that video was an example of an acute behavioural disorder death in police contact that had occurred in the Met some years previously.
And when was that video available?
That was available, that was produced in 2007, so it was available as of then. We actually sort of disseminated it through our national network and offered it to other forces as a training aid. And I'm aware that a number of forces took that up.
And I think you're aware that at least one of the forces at that time in Scotland took that video.
Strathclyde.
Strathclyde. So that video, which had been prepared, was at least available in the Strathclyde force for some time. Now, we are moving on to criteria 7, which is the final criteria, but I'm also conscious that it's perhaps time for the
We'll
break.
take a 15-minute break.
Wouldn't split it.
That's great.
Thank you. We were just about to turn to the final criteria that you had identified in section 3 of your report, which was someone responsible for oversight, both day-to-day and strategically. And this was the final criteria for an OST programme to contain these elements. It would be fit for purpose if it contained them. And this was criteria 7 that you raised. And if we could look perhaps at, I'm on the wrong page, page 9 of your report.
Yep.
And it is paragraph R
Yes.
for Romeo. And maybe we could have this on the screen, which is SBPI 00667. And I'm just going to read out a section of this. So it's page 9, and the letter we're looking for on page 9 is R. There it is. And so criteria 7, someone responsible for oversight day-to-day and strategically. And R here, you see, from the formation of Police Scotland, that would be on 1st of April 2013.
Yeah.
It would appear that no specific champion or one person within the senior management had direct responsibility for OST. And you've taken account of the role of Inspector Young, but that's not what you're
Not at
looking
that level, no.
No. There was a management committee who appear to have responsibility for training in general, of which OST appears to have sat under. Although there was the central team at the training school, that's Tullyallen, they do not appear to have had the mandate to monitor and control OST delivery at a local level.
Yes, I think that's supported by Inspector Young's testimony.
And that's what you were talking about earlier, where although there was some consistency achieved at Tullyallen, that when officers went to different areas of Scotland, they were perhaps dealing with different types of equipment, different methods, and have to get additional training.
Yes.
And then you said the lack of strategic leadership coupled with no person or group with overall control of OST would have greatly reduced the effectiveness and accountability of any OST programme.
Yes.
And when you say greatly reducing the effectiveness and accountability, what do you mean by that?
Well, certainly from an accountability point of view, it's unable to be able to quantify or actually prove evidence-wise that what was being delivered and how it was being delivered was consistent across the force area. It's obvious that, you know, with all the different evidence that's been presented to the inquiry and the documents presented, that this was not the case, and therefore, you know, if Police Scotland were asked that specific question, what do you deliver, how do you deliver it, they might have on paper what they believed should be being delivered, but there was no way of evidencing the fact that that was being delivered, or the methodology of how it was being delivered in the force area.
Thank you. And then can we look at page 11 of your report, please?
Just on that point as well,
sorry.
just to make sure that I say, when I mean about a strategic lead, that's somebody who sits within the senior management level within the force. So if I give the example of the Met where I was, the officer in charge, I had direct responsibility for officer safety across the whole of the Met, was a commander level. So that's an equivalent to what we would call an ACPO level thing. So it's above a chief superintendent, and it's within someone like Police Scotland or a county force, you'd be looking at somebody with assistant constable, deputy assistant constable level. So up to that senior strategic level of the force, somebody would have that champion, that direct responsibility for that. They may have other ones like public order as well, but they would certainly have officer safety as one of the umbrellas under their management.
Someone like an assistant chief constable.
Yeah, somebody who can
ACC.
directly influence and can directly feed into the chief constable.
At the highest
At that strategic level,
really.
yes.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to move on to the section of your report that highlights problems with OST delivery in 2015, and I think essentially you've given a summary of different issues which you've become aware of as part of your consideration of the papers. And page 11 contains these, and if we look at paragraph CC, which is Charlie Charlie. And there are 9 bullet points listed on page 11, and I'd just briefly like to go through them to make sure we've covered absolutely everything that you summarise here. And you say the following points are raised within these divisional reports which support my findings and highlight the problems with OST delivery at that time. And that was in the period leading up to May 2015.
That's correct, yes.
All assessments were left to the discretion of the local divisions. Some did not have a coordinator or OST lead in place. Without set assessment criteria, the quality of physical skills and knowledge is impossible to predict and quantify. It is left to the trainer on the day and their subjective opinion as to competency.
That's correct.
And is there anything else that you'd like to add? We've discussed this today. Anything else that we've not
No, I
covered?
just think that highlights across the board, and it's been supported by testimony from Inspector Young and certainly from the documents reviewed.
There was a lack of any OST coordinator lead in some divisions. Without a central coordinating person or body, consistency of delivery or content cannot be guaranteed. And this is mirrored with the lack of central oversight at Police Scotland.
Yes.
And you've talked to us about the central oversight or the strategic level. What did you envisage in relation to this role of OST coordinator or lead?
Obviously, the strategic lead would need somebody to be able to action work that needs to be done. So I would have expected somebody at, say, an inspector level, possibly a chief inspector or even down to a sergeant, to be able to give that overview and take control of the not only the student officer delivery, but also the refresher and delivery elsewhere across the force area.
Could that have been someone akin to Inspector Young?
Yes.
And then you say there was no agreed teaching methodology being used across all the divisions. Explain, demonstrate, imitate and practice. EDIP, I think is like typo there.
Yeah.
And problem, solution, teach appear to have been the main one used. These differences in approach can confuse learners and increase ambiguities in message and skills acquisition.
Correct, yes.
And we mentioned that already
Yes.
today. The next one is no mention of trainer development or recertification, a major requirement for any OST programme delivery.
Yes.
Pages 18, 20 and 21 of your report mentions the large benchmarking process and a number of English forces being contacted for comparison. The best practice established from this part of the review can be found on pages 20 and 21. This supports a number of the recommendations this report makes. Now, tell us what you're referring to here.
So this is the discussion we were having about the benchmarking against other forces, so looking at other forces across the UK. That comparison was included in the report and recommendations were formulated based on that benchmarking exercise. So it wasn't just about, as you said earlier, just bringing it across because it was, other people were doing it. It had actually been structured and recommended on how it would be implemented across the force area.
Thank you. Page 19 highlights the variation in content and delivery between divisions and that users found the training too complicated to learn in the time provided, irrelevant and boring. This is evidence of no oversight or review process or ongoing development for the programme or trainers. Without regular review and development, OST sessions can become stale and not reflect the current trends and risks officers face. And I don't think I've discussed with you the issue of trainees or probationers or officers who find the training to be boring and perhaps not engaging them. And was this something that you also took into account?
Yes, yes. It's something that we've seen across in other areas and other organisations. That constant review and changing support resources, etc., is an important part of the programme to keep it fresh and to show that it's reflecting the current trends and the current requirements, not only of the officers, but of the public as well. So without that development, it will become stale, it will become very repetitive, and officers will switch off and not pay the attention that they need to those particular inputs.
And if officers have that reaction to training and switch off, as you say, what impact does that have on their retention in terms of retaining the skills and knowledge that's been provided to them?
Yes, well, it's a well-known fact that if you don't practice a skill, it degrades and it becomes less effective. So if they're not using it generally on a day-to-day basis, without that continual refreshing period, they're going to lose the ability or possibly forget how to use it, or even worse still, they're going to apply it incorrectly and possibly cause danger or injury to the person that they're applying it to.
We've heard a phrase from other witnesses about memory fade or something about fading.
Yeah.
Is that something you recognise?
Yes, again, as I say, it's a skill. It's well documented within the sort of learning and development world. That's why, certainly for first aid training, there's now a legal requirement from the health and safety to refresh that knowledge and those skills on a regular basis. Officer safety was no different. It was written into the requirement that if you don't refresh and practice those skills, you're gonna lose them.
And then if we can move the page up, please. We're looking at page 20. Mentions disparities and confusion in the use of force reporting process, including what should be recorded and how to report incidents. A robust data gathering process is invaluable in monitoring and developing OST. Specific guidance should be used as to what constitutes a use of force and where to record these facts. And you make reference to another section in your report regarding the use of force SOP.
Yes.
So was this what you were talking about earlier about apparent disparities between the use of force SOP and information that was contained within the 2013?
Yes, that's information from the 2015 where officers were actually, mentioning the fact that they were unsure, they didn't know the process, they didn't know what to record or what not to record. And I think based on the SOP didn't give sufficient guidance, and the form that we've produced or we've seen doesn't fully cover all of the areas that it should. It's very much centred on the use of irritant sprays rather than a general use of force.
So you looked at complaints or issues being raised by the officers in their evidence about uncertainties that they had at the time, and you've identified that there may have been a insufficient detail provided.
Yes.
In the SOP.
And without that information, you can't tailor what your package is and how to develop the package. One of the big things that we found when it was implemented across the rest of the UK, and a lot of forces were then finding that there were techniques that they were teaching that hadn't ever been used over maybe an 18-month period, but officers were still being refreshed on them and trained in them, but they weren't being used. So it just allows you to tailor the package or the programme to best meet the needs of the officers. And if it's something that they're not using, then why spend the time? Why not replace it with something else, or just take it out and spend more time on the things that they are using on a regular basis?
So with that data, robust data, you can more appropriately direct your resources, which may be limited, and the time you have, which may be limited, to things that are of practical use.
Yes.
And being used on a regular basis. The next bullet point is 8, pages 21 to 23, provide a summary of findings showing this to be a well-evidenced and balanced review and would appear to mirror most of the issues I have identified from my review of the various documents. Is that the 2015 review by Inspector Young?
Yes. Inspector Young, yes. I think he did a very good job in reviewing the standard of the training at that time.
Thank you. So insofar as we've heard evidence from Inspector Young about the review and his recommendations, would you say you're largely in support of his
Very much so, yes.
position? Thank you. And then the final bullet point in this chapter, page 24 onwards, contains the proposed recommendations from this report. I agree with most of the recommendations in this report. That's Inspector Young's
Yes.
report. I would, however, like to add additional comment on a couple of them. 6. Any review should be subject to more stringent review. The author mentions having no data on assaults or complaints. These are important sources to assist in the tailoring of the OST programme. And can you explain why that is?
Well, certainly for complaints, if we see an increase in complaints of subjects being handcuffed and being injured during handcuffing, then it would stipulate to the organisation that possibly more time needs to be spent on handcuff refresher training. So again, the package can be tailored and specialised to meet that complaint need. If officers are being assaulted in a particular way, say for example they're being bitten, what could we possibly put in place to prevent officers being bitten in the way of either a technique or additional information around that type of assault?
So we've heard previous evidence from Lady Ailish Angelini in relation to 2 reports that she's prepared that are before the chair for consideration. And she expressed the view that although people sometimes think data is not the most exciting part of her report, that it can be very useful to highlight hotspots, as she described them, or essentially areas where problems are taking place. They can then identify what those problems are, what the cause of that is, and perhaps adapt, maybe training, maybe equipment, maybe something else, to adapt and resolve that problem so there are not as many injuries or, in her case, deaths.
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
I would. I mean, data in itself is a very good tool, but when you look at the data across the board and reflect into other parts of the training, it will support and evidence decisions that you wish to make in relation to where the programme goes.
Thank you. And then you talk about important sources to assist in the tailoring of the OST programme. Number 9, there should be a specific programme for refresher training. Whilst this should mirror the initial syllabus, it must have the ability to develop and update officers as they progress in service. Talk to us about that.
So, as I said earlier, the basic programme, the initial training that officers get is about teaching them a set of skills. What we then need to take into consideration is that operational officers are using some of those skills, like handcuffing, on a regular basis. So it's about giving them a process or a programme that is tailored to their needs rather than the needs of a new officer who's never had these skills before. So whilst the core principles or the core elements of the programme need to be included, handcuffing, empty hands, conflict management, etc., use of force, how that's delivered and how that's put across, or the emphasis that's placed on that, should be slightly different, or is normally different for serving officers who are already experienced in applying those skills than it should be for an initial student officer.
So that could be more of a bespoke training programme for officers who already have experience in the field.
Yes. So as I've said before, the scenario-based training element of the training is a great tool to identify any, I wouldn't say bad habits, but identify any trends that are sneaking into operational policing. It allows you to address them and get people back to where they possibly need to be. And it also identifies other areas that may need further input, such as handcuffing, etc., at the next set of refreshers. So it allows you to develop a programme over a period of months or years to best suit the needs of what you're seeing coming through the door.
And would that type of a more specific or bespoke programme also assist with dealing with perhaps lack of engagement or people feeling it was boring? Or
Yes, I think that's because you're changing the programme on a regular basis. It doesn't mean changing the content, but the methodology of delivery, how you're putting that across, what you're concentrating on or focusing on, helps And when you can evidence that with the data, you can turn around to the staff and say, we're doing this because, you know, you might think you can handcuff, but we've seen an increase of 32% in handcuff complaints. You know, we're injuring people putting handcuffs on, so we're going to look at handcuffs. So you can actually evidence using the data why you're spending time on particular subject matters.
And those being trained can then see the practical application and the reasons for
Yes.
the benefits of
Yeah.
that training. And then you say 20 and 21, this is one of the most important points raised by the author. Good practice comes from the top, so such a central unit would lead by example and provide a point of focus for all OST matters. Having local SPOCs, specific points of contact, also enhances communication and dissemination of information. Can you explain to the Chair what you were talking about here?
So a lot of other forces, including my old force in the Met, we had a central team that were responsible, very similar to the college at Tullyallen. We were responsible for all probationary student officer training. However, we were also responsible for the training of trainers and the monitoring and development of those trainers. So my team used to go out and monitor training at the local level, and at the time, before the changes in training within the Met, we had over 500 Cascade trainers within the Met who were delivering. So we were monitoring and managing a group of 500 officers. That allowed us to have a central overview of what was happening across the whole of the force area. We could pass that information up the chain, but also on each of those areas where the training was being delivered, there was one identified lead trainer who had direct contact with us. So if they had a problem locally or something was happening or they were getting feedback from the officers who they were training around a particular problem or a particular issue, that could be fed straight back into the central team. Central team could look at some methodology to deal with it or resolve it, and we could either then pass that out straight away or roll it into the next set of refresher training. As I said, officers back then were doing 2 6-hour sessions, so we had the opportunity to get to any officer within 6 months with a result or a response to what those particular problems were. So it was a cascade down and a cascade up and a brief up model that worked quite well.
And that was in a situation where they had access to you?
Yes.
And you were the head of training and then moved on to strategy?
Yeah. So my team that I had at the time, they had geographical responsibility for an area. So they looked after, so there was that close connection between the trainers on area, the trainer that was at centre, so they knew who they could get in contact with, and they then came up through me, you know, and went to where it needed to go to.
Right, thank you. And you say here that good practice comes from the top.
Yes.
And would you agree that with Inspector Young that that's very significant?
I think yes. I think he was in a position at the level he was at to be able to influence what was happening at Tullyallen and lead that side of the training. However, he was neither mandated or had the influence to be able to do a lot of the other things that he could have done or needed to be done in relation to officer safety.
Let's move on, please. You were asked a question by the inquiry to look at all the papers and express a view on whether the programme of training in 2015 was fit for purpose. And I'd like to move on to that, please. You deal with this in paragraph DD, Delta Delta, bottom of page 11. And you say, taking all of this into consideration, I must consider, was the programme in 2015 fit for purpose? And the simple answer, I would say, is no. Based on what has been produced and some of the testimony provided to the inquiry by officers involved in the delivery and review of OST at the time, and that would include Inspector Young, Inspector Bradley was later, but yeah, a number of officers have given inquiry statements, and you saw those as well. I would suggest the content was recognised, although somewhat outdated, lacked clarity, and in some places was actually inaccurate. And does that really sum up your overall views on
It does
the
at
training that
at-
was
at-
available?
At the relevant time, yes.
Yes. And then EE, however, with the lack of oversight and control of delivery, it is impossible to confirm whether officers were receiving what was expected or considered at the time to be the latest advice, guidance, or if it was indeed fit for purpose. The answer must therefore be that Police Scotland are unable to show that it was based on the evidence reviewed. So there's not just the issue of the materials themselves, the content of the manual, the lesson plans, the instruction manual, the SOP. You've detailed all of those issues today, but it's not simply that there were issues with the content. I think what you're saying at EE, Echo, is that it was impossible to confirm what the officers were actually receiving.
Yeah, for the simple reason the processes were not in place. Without those processes, you cannot evidence or answer that specific question.
And I think we've heard evidence from Inspector Young. And even if we assumed for the moment that the materials in 2013 manual and other materials that we've looked at were of very good quality and there were none of these issues that you've talked about today. So even if we assume they were of a good standard, the difficulty would be in establishing who was taught what.
Yes.
Now, Inspector Young did give evidence to the inquiry, and he said the manual, the 2013 manual at least, was provided to all probationer officers at the commencement of their training at Tullyallen, and all OST instructors from the 1st of September 2013. And as we went through that, he identified PC Ashley Tomlinson as one of those, PC James McDonough, PC Kaylee Good, and he also identified PC Alan Smith as a trainer who would have had access to the 2013 manual. He also said that all training and recertification training for officers who had had a number of years service would have been under the manual, or should have been under the manual.
Should would be the word I would use.
Should have been.
But there's no way to prove that.
But no way to prove that. And that included PC Payton, PC Walker, Acting Sergeant Maxwell, PC Short, and PC Gibson. And at that time they were getting annual refresher training of 1 day a year. Right. And with Inspector Young, we did look at statements that were given by a number of trainers who had looked at, provided and delivered training to them. So the chair has that evidence in front of him. But against that background, you have concerns about what was actually delivered.
Yes, I think with taking all of the documentation into consideration, both of the reports, the 2012 manual for the trainers, the 2013 manual for the students, the standard operating procedures across the board, there are a number of ambiguities, a number of missing information in relation to how things will be done, how things should be done, and I think all of that combined, specifically with Inspector Young's findings from his 2015 report, just point to the fact that at that time, I think you'd ask the question, you'd get an answer, but if I asked, well, prove it, it was impossible to prove at that time.
And can we then move on, please, to FF, Foxtrot? Whether access to this updated information would have changed the officer's approach to this situation is difficult to say. So you were asked by the inquiry what difference would have this have made. And you're saying it's difficult to say. With the additional information on acute behavioural disturbance and a clearer picture of options to deal with such subjects and the possible impact of their actions, the officers could then have considered a softer approach using de-escalation techniques. By keeping their distance, the requirement for physical interaction or restraint is reduced until such time as it might be deemed necessary by the actions of the subject or an increased risk or danger to the public or officers. They could have waited for other units to arrive to assist in limiting Mr. Biles' movement, contain rather than restrain. So you've highlighted that, I think today, you've gone through the manual, Module 1, Officer Safety Training, and identified that training was available. There was training, for example, on tactical communications. But with better training, the officers may have been better equipped to take alternative approaches.
That would be my findings from the review. I think there was more information. There were other versions, certainly in relation to de-escalation, and I think we'll come across that tomorrow with one of the specific questions that was posed by the chair. But it's with the increased information in relation to ABD, the risk factors, possibly identifying the possibility that Mr. Bayo was suffering from ABD or some form of crisis. I think that would have probably triggered officers into considering their approach.
Thank you. And then GG Golf. I have been asked what the impact of this would have been on a hypothetical reasonable officer. In my opinion, it wouldn't have prevented the officer from carrying out their duties. It may, however, not have provided them with all the best tools or information available to do their job. The analogy I might use would be that of someone driving a really old car. Does it get them to work or the shops? Yes. Would it pass an MOT? Possibly not. Could you expand on that analogy?
I think that the training that was being delivered was, as I've said previously, I think it was dated and in some areas misleading. I think with the most up-to-date training and the processes in place, the officers would have been slightly better equipped to deal with it. My analogy is in relation to officers who, haven't received any training. They can still probably do what they need to do, but whether that would be being done up to date with the latest applications, or whether that would be totally suitable for training as it is now, or as it should have been, I don't think that would be the case. I think they were somewhat restricted in relation to that particular area of their development.
Thank you. I'd like to move on now to page 12. We're sticking with page 12, but further down the page, it's section 4 of your report. And this moves away from the 7 criteria for good training and moves into some specific points that have been raised with you by the inquiry team. And you were asked some specific questions which you've actually detailed at paragraph B on the screen. If we can move up, please, so that we can also see G and H. It might be that we can't see it all on one page. Let's start with identifying the first question. So it's A. You were asked who was in charge in relation to a response team attending a knife incident. Now this is where the inquiry team have asked you, can you identify for us what training is available in relation to this question? And they've identified a number of these. Yeah. B is officers' communications with ACR, including the requirement for feedback when attending a grade 1 knife call. C, carrying out a dynamic risk assessment. D, identification of subjects who are intoxicated or experiencing mental health crisis or suffering from ABD or ED, and actions then to be taken. E, tactical options for approaching an individual reported to be on a public road carrying a knife, and there are 4 of these, and we discussed these previously in your earlier evidence, Mr. Graves. Rendezvous point, observe wait feedback, de-escalation, and verbal dominance, coined as a hard stop. F, the principles of preclusion, justification, and necessity in relation to use of force. G, if we can move up the page, please, is training on profiled offender behaviour and reasonable officer response. H, restraint insofar as it relates to the application of weight and/or pressure applied to the subject, the number of officers involved, the length of the restraint, the use of a safety officer to monitor the breathing of the subject, any risk to life caused by restraint. So there are a number of different areas,
Yes.
7 specific areas that you've been asked to look through and identify what training was available. And you've touched on a number of these in order to give examples of your concerns, which we've gone through today. And you were also asked, when you were dealing with each of these A to H issues and training, if you could identify some separate areas.
Yes.
And let's just look at the areas you were asked to cover in each response. And we see them here at C. The answers will be provided under the following headings and numbers. So you give us 9 headings, paragraphs, chapters, where you will deal with each of these in relation to each
Yeah,
question.
hopefully to just make it easier to reference the answers to each of the questions, yeah.
Thank you so much. And let's just go through these briefly now so we know where we're going. Number 1, what training was delivered by Police Scotland in 2015? So for example, on the question A, who was in charge in relation to a response team attending a knife incident, you would start your response by identifying training that was delivered by Police Scotland in 2015. Will that largely be from the 2013 manual?
It would be, yes.
2, was that training fit for purpose? If not, what was the likely impact of any defects, inaccuracies or inadequacies identified? 3, what training was delivered by the College of Policing in 2015? And so that's used as a comparator.
That's correct, yeah.
I think, would it be fair to say that we don't want to suggest that College of Policing is perfect in any way or the gold standard, but it is a comparator from a nearby jurisdiction.
Yes, yes. It's dealing with similar issues, similar situations, and how the two training packages correlate.
So it's a mechanism and a comparator,
Yeah.
rather than holding it up as a counsel of perfection.
Oh, definitely not, no.
No, thank you. 4, how did the College of Policing training differ from that delivered by Police Scotland? So you then identified distinctions and differences
Yes.
that may be of significance. 5, if the hypothetical reasonable officer had received the training delivered by the College of Policing in 2015, so this is a hypothetical reasonable officer in Police Scotland,
Yes.
and if they had received the training in the College of Policing manual, how would their actions potentially have differed from those of officers who may have received the Police Scotland training in 2015?
Yes.
So again, looking at the difference in the training and what impact that may have had on officers. 6, what training is currently delivered by Police Scotland? So then you move away from 2015 and you move to the current position, which we described earlier today as the 2022.
Yes, so we're still a couple of
materials.
years behind, yes.
And always remembering and understanding that Police Scotland's training continuously evolves and develops and is improved.
Yes, definitely.
7, is that training fit for purpose? And if not, how might the training be improved? 8, if the hypothetical reasonable officer in Police Scotland had received the training currently delivered by Police Scotland, how would their actions potentially have differed from those of officers who may have received the Police Scotland training in 2015? So again, looking at a comparison between then and now.
Yes.
So 8 is a sort of then and now comparison in Police Scotland. And then 9, what training is currently delivered by the College of Policing? So again, providing that comparison with College of Policing as it now or 2022. And you've covered all of those topics as you went through the different questions that were asked by the inquiry.
That's correct, yes.
Right. Thank you. Now, there were 7 topics, A to H, 7 questions that the inquiry specifically asked you. And I think from reading your report, there were 3 where we can say there was no guidance or training found in the materials by you.
That's correct, yes.
I'd like to start with those three topics where there simply was no guidance and no training. Or another expression that you use within your report is there was nothing of note. So there may have been none or there may have been nothing of note.
Certainly from the documents, I haven't been able to find anything within the documents I've reviewed.
And largely this is what would have been delivered under the 2013 manual. So the three areas are question A, who was in charge in relation to a response team attending a knife incident? B, officers. If we just go back to the initial A to H, that's probably easier at this moment in time. Right up at the top, thank you. Yes, so it's A, B and E. So A, they're all on this one page, who was in charge. B, officers' communications with ACR, including the requirement for feedback when attending a grade 1 knife call. And E, tactical options for approaching an individual reported to be on a public road carrying a knife. And of those four tactical options under the letter E for echo, 3 of them you were unable to find any training on.
Correct.
And that was rendezvous point, number 1, observe, wait, feedback, number 2, and verbal dominance, number 4.
Yes.
So the only one you could find some training was de-escalation.
Escalation, yeah.
I'll go through each of these in turn, if I may, Mr. Graves. A, first of all, who was in charge in relation to a response team attending a knife incident? Now, you deal with this question on pages 13 and 14 of your report,
Yes.
which you have in front of you. And we could move on to 13. And you point out that there was nothing of note in the manual or the other 2015 training materials that you looked at that related to the hierarchy of command in such incidents. But you do point out that it may be that other training programs not specifically connected to OST, such as training for ACR staff, might have held some information on this.
That's correct, yes.
Do you think that this would be a useful topic, who's in charge, to have in an OST training programme?
It would certainly be worthy of mention, I think, within the assessment of risk under the NDM. So again, looking at how, you know, when we look at backup or we look at support as a tactical option, how you might call that, what might be the considerations of getting certain officers to come and assist you, or specific trained officers or equipment that you might need, how that would work, who needs to authorise it, can you call it in, etc.
And could this be part of the stress inoculation of devising scenarios where people were trained in relation to what to do in
It could certainly be
situations?
part of the debrief in relation to, you know, let's say, for example, the scenario was being confronted by an individual with a knife. What are the options? And if one of the options was to withdraw, did you then consider transmitting that back to ACR, etc.? So there's different ways that you could address it. I think it would certainly form part of the initial discussion around assessing risk and understanding different tactical options that might be available or might not be available because of certain restrictions.
Thank you. We've heard evidence from Inspector Young, as you know, which in his statement he's also given some information to the chair as well as his oral evidence. And I'm not going to put it up on the screen, but SBPI 00362, paragraph 72, he said, I have been asked whether there was training for officers on who would be in charge in relation to a response team attending a knife incident. There is no training on this so far as I am aware. So certainly, although there may be other training materials, Inspector Young doesn't appear to have been aware of any of that. And we've obviously heard a lot of evidence from the people who were in Hayfield Road on the 3rd of May 2015. But before I refer you to their evidence, do you have a concern about the fact that this is not trained as part of the OST?
It's not really something that would form a direct part of it. Things like dealing with incidents is part of the tactical options, as I've said, would be if you're dealing with say a situation where the person may be in possession of a knife. Again, then you would look at the training around for edge weapons, and part of that would be the different tactical options that would be available. One of those may well be, as we've said, standoff, but there's nothing in the actual training manual that directs an officer or would direct an officer to that particular path. Certainly within other training packages within the UK, that would be a valid and very valid tactical option, and is raised throughout the training and forms part of that support mechanism for officers possibly dealing with edge weapon incidents. Very similar to a firearms incident, you wouldn't just send an unarmed officer into a firearms incident. You're more likely to have them stand back, report, etc.
And it's obviously a matter for the chair, the evidence that we've heard, but if I could summarise some of the evidence that we've heard that Inspector Stewart, who was in the ACR, was initially absent from post, but on return thought the divisional officers were in charge. That would be the PIO, Inspector Kay, and perhaps Sergeant Maxwell. Sergeant Dalgleish at the ACR thought Inspector Kay and Sergeant Maxwell had command. Sergeant Bissett, the supervisor, was away from post. The controller, PC Masterton, was under the mistaken impression that Inspector Stewart and Sergeant Dalgleish had oversight, but they were absent from post. D.I. Robson, the duty SIO for Fife Police, described going to assist colleagues, but not as a supervisory officer. He thought the most senior officer was Inspector Kay once he arrived. Inspector Kay didn't arrive until after the restraint had concluded, and thought ACR were in command. Sergeant Maxwell, who was in charge of, acting Sergeant Maxwell in charge of Team 4 response team, but he thought Inspector Kay took charge when he arrived. Maxwell thought officers were autonomous and wholly responsible unless he thought it necessary to intervene. So until he arrived, the officers themselves were in charge. He didn't arrive until the restraint had been achieved, and PC Walker thought Maxwell was in charge, and PC Payton wanted to take control himself of the situation on his arrival. So there seemed to have been a number of different beliefs and views about who was in charge. And that will be a matter for the chair to make sense of all of that evidence. But do you have any concerns that in the absence of specific training about who was in charge in relation to a response team attending a knife incident, that this could generate confusion amongst the people who are actually involved? Very much so.
Certainly in answer to, I think, the next question in relation to the ACR, there should be a natural handover of control of that incident from ACR to the first officers arriving on scene, but then the overview and supervision of that incident being down to the supervisors in charge of those officers. There may not be it's on scene, but an old terminology that used to be used was, I've got a listening watch. I'm listening to what's going on, and I will interject if I need to as a supervisor to ensure safety or to make sure that certain things have been done. So the role of the supervisor can't just be pushed to one side if you're not on scene. You should have that overview if you're listening and you're aware of the situation, to have that overview of relation to your officers going to deal with this situation. Is everything in place that they might need, and have they considered everything that needs to be thought about in relation to this particular incident? So there is a natural requirement for supervisory officers to have that degree of understanding and control over such incidents, but there should also be a distinct embarkation between ACR and the officers arriving on scene and saying, right, well, we've now got this, we're on scene, we're dealing with this, so they then become in charge of that situation until such time as a supervisor, inspector or sergeant arrives on the scene.
Rather than thinking about what the situation may be, can we, if we focus purely on the training which is provided to probationers or officers of different levels of experience and years of service, in the absence of any specific training in OST, either in the manual or any other of materials, can you see that that may be a concern? That officers who are being sent to respond to a knife incident do not appear to have been given any training in 2015 to allow them to answer the question, who is in charge?
Yes, I do.
And what are your concerns about that?
Specifically that, the fact that nobody there is going to take charge of that situation and have an overview or an oversight in relation to what is occurring and what may need to be done and what resources may need to be sent or required to deal with that situation. So somebody somewhere needs to step up and take that control. Based on what I've reviewed, it's likely to be whoever's shouts the loudest and makes that jump to make that decision, rather than a designated individual or a designated pathway of who should be in charge at that particular time and how and when that might get handed over.
And so training could perhaps plug that gap or resolve the confusion and clearly identify or provide training to officers to put them in a better position to clearly identify who is in charge and who they should be taking instructions from.
Certainly when you start looking at major incidents and critical incidents, that structure is in place. However, that doesn't form part of OST, and it's from what I've seen, there's no specific training being shown to us in relation to giving guidance along that command pathway, shall we say.
Thank you. And what were College of Policing in England and Wales and Northern Ireland doing?
At that time, very similar. There was nothing specific within the OST manual or training program that would dictate that. As I said, there was some guidance in the approach to incidences with edge weapons, with knives, looking at the probability or the possibility of standing off, observe and report, things like that. So they were shown as tactical options specifically for an edge weapon, but nothing specifically within the OST. It was mentioned in other training programs around critical incidents and things like that, as I've mentioned, but nothing specific within the OST from the College of Policing.
Thank you. And you've talked, if we could look at paragraph 5, please. This was the question regarding the hypothetical reasonable officer. And if the hypothetical reasonable officer had received the training from College of Policing, would that have made a difference effectively? But I think from what you've said, perhaps, you see here, I believe a reasonable officer would have recognised that this incident had potential to be a major incident and that specialist resources may be required. I believe the ACR would have confirmed the attendance of the local supervisor to confirm primacy and tactical command at the scene. Until that time, the ACR inspector would have maintained control of the incident. So is it your view that the hypothetical reasonable officer would have recognised or believed the ACR inspector would have maintained control of the incident?
I think, based certainly on that level of training, yes, they would have expected that individual or the ACR to have control until such time as they arrived on scene.
So, although the College of Policing training in 2015 perhaps was not as expansive as you say it is now, you still consider that it would have better equipped the hypothetical reasonable officer.
Yes,
In that
yes. I mean,
scenario.
certainly having witnessed similar calls like this being dealt with over those years, then yes, I would have expected that to be a natural progression where the control room holds control until such time as somebody takes that control on the ground, and that's either normally the officers arriving on the scene or the supervisor arriving after the officers.
Thank you. Well, I'm conscious of the time, and I wonder if that might be inappropriate.
Well, we'll stop now. We'll continue with your evidence tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, Mr. Graves.
Sir?
I will adjourn.